Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Friday, February 13th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today is 67.5 degrees, with a low dipping to 49.5 degrees, so layers might be your best friend as we ease into the weekend. Coming up, we'll unpack the backlash that's ignited over President Trump's aggressive immigration push in Minnesota and examine the motivations behind his administration's decision to cut CDC funding aimed at sanctuary states. Plus, we'll cover other key developments making headlines across the nation. All this and more on Alex's News. Stay tuned. Operation Metro Surge in Minnesota is officially winding down today, but the fallout is still growing. Ethan, you've been following this from the start. What was this surge in plain terms?
Grace, according to BBC News and The Washington Post, Operation Metro Surge was the Trump administration's biggest domestic immigration crackdown so far. It launched back on December 1st of last year, targeting the Minneapolis-St. Paul Metro and nearby communities. At its peak, about 3,000 federal agents, mostly from ICE and Border Patrol, were deployed there, roughly 5 times the size of the Minneapolis Police Department. The administration called it a mission to arrest criminal, illegal aliens, and people with final deportation orders. Many Minnesota officials called it political retribution against a democratic, so-called sanctuary state.
That word, retribution, keeps coming up. What do critics say made this different from routine immigration enforcement?
Critics, including Governor Tim Walz and Attorney General Keith Ellison, told outlets like PBS and the Star-Tribune that this looked more like an occupation than normal law enforcement. They argue it was imposed on a state that did not have an immigration-driven crime wave, and that Trump had openly promised retribution and reckoning for Minnesota after the 2024 election. Legal scholars quoted in Bloomberg Law say that combination of rhetoric and an unusually large federal footprint is why Minnesota's suing, claiming the state was singled out for punishment. Supporters, like Trump's border czar Tom Homan, insist it was simply a tough but necessary safety operation.
Let's talk about what people actually saw on the ground. How did agents operate day to day during this surge?
Reporting from CNBC and local stations like Fox 9 and WCCO describes early morning raids that quickly scaled up. Agents often wore masks or balaclavas, rode in unmarked vehicles, and showed up outside schools, workplaces, and apartment complexes, which led to lockdowns and shelter-in-place orders. The ACLU of Minnesota says agents used facial recognition tools on protesters and alleged targets, and civil rights complaints describe street sweeps that pulled in U.S. citizens and legal residents. Minnesota Public Radio and PBS also documented detainees being moved out of state almost immediately, making it much harder for families and lawyers to find them.
Federal officials say local police were helpful. Did Minnesota law enforcement really cooperate that much?
Tom Homan repeatedly praised what he called unprecedented cooperation, telling CNBC that local police cracked down on protesters he labeled public safety threats and that county jails grew more willing to tip off ICE about release dates. But Governor Walz, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, and others told The Washington Post that what actually happened is local police got pulled away from normal duties to manage protests, traffic chaos, and panicked calls. They argue that whatever coordination occurred was more about keeping order amid the surge than endorsing it. In other words, they say they were managing the fallout from federal choices, not partnering in them.
The administration keeps stressing they were going after dangerous criminals. What do we know now about who was actually arrested?
Federal officials told BBC News and Congress that more than 4,000 people were arrested during roughly 10 weeks of the surge, and they highlighted rapists, murderers, and gang members. But an analysis of ICE's own data by groups like TRAC and the Libertarian Cato Institute, reported by the Star-Tribune and factcheck.org, found serious violent offenders were a small minority, only about 5% of the first 2,000 arrestees. By January of this year, roughly 42.7% of surge detainees in Minnesota had no criminal convictions or pending charges at all, up sharply from about 15% the year before. Most of the rest had misdemeanors like DWI, shoplifting, or disorderly conduct, not the headline-level crimes the rhetoric suggested.
That's a big gap between the rhetoric and the numbers. Were there other examples where the administration's narrative didn't match what reporters found?
Yes. Fox 9's investigative team found that some of the worst cases touted in DHS press releases were people already in state or federal prison for unrelated crimes. Metro Surge simply took custody when they walked out, which is a routine transfer that padded the surge totals. Another big point of tension is the alleged Somali-American fraud angle, linked in public messaging to an earlier Feeding Our Future case. The Star Tribune and several think tank reports say only about 23 people of Somali descent were arrested during the surge, and none have been publicly charged in that specific fraud scheme. That has fueled the sense in immigrant communities that they were broadly vilified for a problem agents did not actually solve.
Beyond arrests, there were some deadly outcomes that really galvanized protests. Start with the first high-profile killing, Renee Good. What happened there?
Renee Nicole Macklin Good was a 37-year-old U.S. citizen, a mother and poet with no criminal record, according to the Star Tribune and CBS Minnesota. She was shot and killed in her car on January 7th, just over 5 weeks ago, by ICE agent Jonathan Ross during an enforcement action in Minneapolis. Federal officials initially claimed she turned her car into a weapon and forced Ross to fire in self-defense. But the Hennepin County Medical Examiner ruled her death a homicide, and witnesses and video cited in state filings, reported by PBS, suggested her car was either stopped or rolling slowly away when the shots were fired.
How did Minnesota respond to that shooting?
Her death sparked the first large anti-occupation protests in Minneapolis and St. Paul, drawing thousands into the streets. The state's Bureau of Criminal Apprehension and Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty quickly opened investigations, and according to the Star Tribune, they accused federal agents of obstructing them, including limiting access to the scene and delaying video. For many residents, Renee Good became the symbol of a U.S. citizen killed in her own neighborhood by officers who were not answerable to local authorities. That sense of someone being killed by outsiders really intensified the anger.
Then there was the killing of protester Alex Preddy. How did that unfold?
Alex Jeffrey Preddy was also 37, a U.S. citizen, an ICU and VA nurse who relatives describe as a peaceful protester. On January 24th, about 3 weeks ago, he was shot near the Bishop Henry Whipple Federal Building in Bloomington during a demonstration. DHS accounts initially suggested he was armed and posed an immediate threat, but video played in Senate hearings and reported by PBS and CBS appears to show him unarmed and already restrained, or in the process of being subdued, when the fatal shot was fired. Local coverage has named 2 Border Patrol agents, Raimundo Gutierrez and Jesus Ochoa, as directly involved.
There was also a death in custody, right? What do we know about that?
Yes, a man named Victor Manuel Diaz died while in ICE custody during the surge, though far less is publicly known about his case. Immigrant rights groups and the Star Tribune describe his death as emblematic of broader concerns over medical neglect, isolation, and those rapid out-of-state transfers. Advocates say Diaz's death highlights that the harm from a surge is not limited to shootings on the street, but extends to what happens behind detention walls. Federal officials have released very few details, which is fueling calls for independent oversight.
We've also heard about citizens and even children swept up by mistake. Can you explain some of those incidents?
ACLU filings and coverage in Native News Online and local TV report Native American citizens and other U.S. citizens being stopped, detained, or even held at gunpoint because agents assumed they were undocumented. One case that's gotten a lot of attention involves 5-year-old Liam Conejo Ramos, who was allegedly detained or threatened during an enforcement encounter, which traumatized both him and his family. There are also stories of an off-duty local police officer and a 55-year-old woman who was just watching an arrest being taken into custody and later released with no charges. These stories, documented by the Star Tribune, have deepened the sense that the operation's net was far too wide and reckless.
Given all that, it's not surprising Minnesota sued. What is the state arguing in court?
On January 12th, about a month ago, Attorney General Keith Ellison, along with Minneapolis and St. Paul, filed a federal lawsuit called State of Minnesota versus Noem, reflecting DHS Secretary Kristi Noem's role. Bloomberg Law reports they're arguing the surge violated the 10th Amendment's anti-commandeering doctrine by effectively forcing Minnesota's infrastructure and police to absorb a huge paramilitary-style presence they did not want. They also raise an equal sovereignty claim, drawing on a Supreme Court case, arguing Minnesota was singled out for political retribution, pointing to Trump's public promises of payback. The state is asking not only for damages but for limits on future surges.
Have judges stepped in to slow or change the surge at all?
The results have been mixed. On January 31st, just under 2 weeks ago, U.S. District Judge Kate Menendez declined to block the surge, saying, as quoted by the Star Tribune, that while its consequences were profound and even heartbreaking, Minnesota had not yet shown it would likely win on its core constitutional claims. But in a separate case, Chief Judge Patrick Schiltz issued a blistering order on January 28th, finding ICE had violated at least 96 court orders across 74 cases in just 1 month, according to the Washington Post. He wrote that ICE is not a law unto itself, and nearly hauled acting ICE Director Todd Lyons into court for contempt before ICE released the detainee at issue.
There was also a fight over how agents policed protests, right?
Yes. In a class action brought by the ACLU of Minnesota, Tincher versus Noem, Judge Menendez initially restricted agents' use of pepper spray and chemical agents against peaceful protesters on January 16th. But the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals quickly put that injunction on hold on January 21st and again on January 25th, signaling skepticism about broad, so-called universal injunctions, as reported by the Star Tribune. And just yesterday, U.S. District Judge Nancy Brazel ordered ICE to improve detainees' access to lawyers at the Whipple building, saying the government failed to plan for the constitutional rights of its civil detainees, according to the Washington Post.
What about criminal accountability for the shootings of Good and Pretty? Where do those investigations stand tonight?
The FBI is leading the federal probe into Renee Good's death, and Homeland Security Investigations is handling Alex Pretty's case. But as of tonight, there are no criminal charges against the agents involved. On the state side, Minnesota's Bureau of Criminal Apprehension and Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty are running parallel investigations and accuse federal agencies of obstruction, including blocking crime scene access and delaying body camera footage. A federal judge has ordered DHS to preserve all evidence in the Pretty case, responding to fears that crucial video is being lost, Bloomberg Law reports. And state prosecutors have sent formal to-he letters to the Justice Department in the Good case, demanding records by next Tuesday, February 17th.
There was even turmoil inside the U.S. Attorney's Office over all this. What happened there?
According to GoVEXEC and the Washington Post, at least 6 senior federal prosecutors in Minnesota resigned in mid-January. They were reportedly protesting DOJ's refusal to treat the Good killing as a potential civil rights case and pressure to focus instead on investigating her associates. That kind of open revolt from career prosecutors is rare and underscores just how polarizing the surge has been inside the federal system. And today, federal prosecutors moved to drop felony assault charges against 2 men arrested at a January 14th protest after video contradicted agents' claims they had violently attacked officers.
All of this spilled into Washington this week, with Senate hearings. What stood out there?
The Senate Homeland Security Committee, chaired by Senator Rand Paul, held tense hearings yesterday and today, and PBS and CBS carried some of the exchanges. Attorney General Ellison told senators that 2 of the 3 homicides recorded in Minneapolis so far this year were committed by federal immigration agents, referring to Good and Pretty. He called the surge a retribution campaign and cited Trump's social media posts. Republican Senator Ron Johnson accused Ellison of encouraging actions that led to those deaths and said he should feel, quote, damn guilty, end quote. Ellison called those claims lies. Senators also watched video that appeared to contradict DHS claims that Good was ramming officers and Pretty was brandishing a gun.
The administration insists all this made Minnesota safer. Do the crime numbers back that up?
The picture is complicated. Minneapolis Police Chief Brian O'Hara has said, in comments reported by local media, that violent crime had already been trending down since 2021 and credits local reforms and partnerships, not immigration raids. Early 2026 data from the police dashboard, summarized by the Star Tribune, shows shooting victims down roughly 76% and homicides down about 67% compared with the same stretch last year, but car thefts and aggravated assaults are up. Critics like Ellison and Waltz argue that if 2 of the city's 3 homicides so far were caused by federal agents, it's hard to say the surge made residents safer overall.
Even as the surge ends, there's a huge fight in Congress over DHS funding. How is Metro surge tied to that?
BBC and The Guardian report that Senate Democrats, led by Chuck Schumer, are filibustering a Homeland Security funding bill, in part because of what happened in Minnesota. They want statutory guardrails on ICE and Border Patrol before they agree to long-term funding. Their demands include banning masks that hide agents' faces, requiring visible ID and body cameras, limiting enforcement near schools, hospitals, and churches, and requiring judicial warrants to enter private homes. They also want tighter rules on big roving surges like this one. Republicans generally defend the surge, but even Senator Rand Paul has called the drawdown in Minneapolis a good step forward toward de-escalation.
Let's talk about the endgame. What exactly did Tom Homan announce about winding down Metro surge?
On February 4th, about 9 days ago, Homan ordered 700 agents pulled out of Minnesota, roughly a quarter of the force, according to CNBC. Then yesterday, at the Whipple Federal Building, he said Operation Metro Surge would officially conclude, with most remaining agents reassigned or sent home over the next week and only a small footprint staying behind temporarily. He called the operation a great success, insisted Minnesota is safer and less of a haven for criminals, and said anyone claiming Trump is backing off mass deportations is, quote, simply wrong, end quote. Interestingly, he even praised Waltz, Frey, and Ellison for what he called practical cooperation, despite their very public criticism.
How are Minnesota leaders and communities reacting to the drawdown?
Governor Waltz told reporters he's cautiously optimistic, but talked about deep damage, generational trauma, and even economic ruin for some families and small businesses, as reported by BBC and the Star Tribune. He is expected to push a $10 million emergency fund for businesses that lost revenue because customers were too afraid to come out, or because protests shut things down. City business groups estimate tens of millions in losses across Minneapolis and St. Paul. Grassroots and immigrant rights organizations say simply removing agents does not erase the fear kids felt seeing raids or the distrust many residents now have toward anyone in a badge.
This has also become part of a larger national debate about Trump-era deployments of federal forces. How are national Democrats framing it?
House Democratic leader Steny Hoyer put out a statement yesterday saying, quote, Trump's federal troops are leaving Minneapolis, but they never should have been there in the first place, end quote. He argued that sending heavily armed federal officers into a city and promising them immunity for using force made tragedies like the deaths of Good and Pretty almost inevitable. Hoyer linked Metro surge to earlier Trump-era deployments in Portland, Los Angeles, and Chicago, which BBC notes have recently been scaled back amid backlash. He is calling for justice for the families and answers for why this level of violence occurred at the hands of federal agents on American streets.
And legally, even with the surge ending, it sounds like this is far from over. What happens next?
Minnesota's lawsuit continues, now focused less on stopping an active operation and more on establishing that rights were violated and limiting similar surges in the future. Legal analysts quoted by the Washington Post and Bloomberg Law say the case raises new questions about how far the federal government can go in flooding a state with law enforcement it doesn't want, and whether doctrines like anti-commandeering and equal sovereignty can restrain that. Many expect at least parts of the case to reach the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, investigations into the deaths of Renee Good, Alex Preddy, and Victor Diaz, and the fate of more than 4,000 people arrested in the surge, will likely shape immigration and civil rights debates, well beyond Minnesota.
A lot to keep watching, even as the agents pull back. Ethan, thanks for walking us through all of it. We have a big public health and politics story this morning. The Trump administration is trying to pull hundreds of millions of CDC dollars from 4 Democratic-led states. Reporter Chloe Nguyen is here to walk us through it. Chloe, what exactly did the White House do?
The administration moved to terminate roughly $600 million in Centers for Disease Control and Prevention public health grants, but only in California, Colorado, Illinois, and Minnesota. According to CalMatters and the Associated Press, the Department of Health and Human Services quietly notified Congress in early February that it planned to withhold or cancel those grants. These are not new proposals. This is money Congress already appropriated, and the states already started using. All 4 states are Democratic-led and have sanctuary or pro-immigrant policies that have repeatedly put them at odds with the Trump administration.
So we're not talking about some obscure line item here. What kinds of programs are actually on the chopping block?
A big chunk is what public health people call the backbone of the system, something known as the Public Health Infrastructure Grant. CalMatters describes it as the funding that pays epidemiologists, lab staff, data analysts, and emergency preparedness planners in health departments across the country. That program exists in all 50 states, but the administration is targeting its grants only in those 4 blue states. On top of that, the Associated Press reports that dozens of HIV and sexually transmitted infection prevention grants, along with LGBTQ-focused and health equity projects, would lose funding too.
Let's unpack that backbone grant first. How would losing that money change day-to-day public health work, especially in a state like California?
California is hit the hardest, with about $180 million at stake overall, including roughly $130 million from that infrastructure grant. CalMatters and the Long Beach Post say that specific pot of money pays for more than 400 jobs in state and local health departments, many of them in rural or underserved communities struggling to hire anyone at all. It also funds modern lab data systems so test results can be reported in real time, and it underwrites planning for emergencies like wildfires, earthquakes, or disease outbreaks. California officials told CalMatters that yanking it midstream would mean immediate layoffs and, in their words, weaken the state's ability to prepare for and respond to public health emergencies.
And beyond those core jobs and systems, what are some of the more targeted programs that could lose support?
In Los Angeles County alone, CalMatters reports that about $6 million aimed at tackling health inequities would disappear, along with more than $1 million for the National HIV Behavioral Surveillance Project. That HIV project tracks behavior and infection trends in high-risk groups like gay and bisexual men and communities of color, which guides where prevention efforts go. The county's public health department warned that losing this money would undercut their responses to measles, avian flu, and seasonal flu, and damage long-term monitoring of sexually transmitted infections and chronic diseases. Officials there told CalMatters the harm would be long-lasting, making communities, quote, less healthy, less safe, and less prosperous, end quote.
What about the Bay Area and other parts of California? Are they seeing similar threats?
Yes, though on a smaller scale in dollar terms. CalMatters notes that Alameda County, which includes parts of the East Bay, stands to lose about $1.3 million that pays frontline staff and disease surveillance work. There are also smaller but very targeted grants, like roughly $876,000 for a prevention research center at UC San Francisco focused on social isolation in older LGBTQ adults. Another around $383,000 goes to the Los Angeles LGBT Center for Community Health and Prevention Services. Public health experts told CalMatters these smaller grants punch above their weight because they're aimed at very high-risk, marginalized communities.
You mentioned HIV and LGBTQ-focused programs more broadly. How are those being singled out in the other states?
In Illinois, The Associated Press reports that a $5.2 million HIV prevention effort at Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago is on the list, along with a $7.2 million CDC grant to the American Medical Association. The administration has publicly criticized the AMA because it supports gender-affirming care for minors, which clashes with a Trump executive order restricting that care. There are also surveillance grants in big urban counties for tracking HIV trends among Black and Latino residents and gay and bisexual men. KFF Health News and the Los Angeles Times both note that similar HIV and equity-focused programs in Republican-led states have not been cut.
That raises the obvious question: what is the official explanation from Washington for why these particular grants in these particular states are being cut?
Publicly, the line from Health and Human Services is that these projects no longer reflect the agency's priorities. According to Cal Matters in the AP, spokespeople have framed this as a shift away from what they call ideologically driven concepts like health equity and diversity, equity and inclusion, or DEI. Last fall, KFF Health News and Iowa Public Radio reported that CDC quietly rewrote its strategic framework to label health equity as ideologically laden and to emphasize supposedly neutral, population-wide interventions. Conservative outlets like the Washington Times have echoed the administration's argument that they are refocusing on core public health functions and moving money away from what they call social engineering.
Have they actually pointed to any specific fraud or misuse with these CDC grants, or is it more rhetorical?
As of this morning, there is no public evidence of grant-specific fraud or mismanagement tied to these cuts. Legal reporters at Bloomberg Law and Just Security note that the administration has not released Inspector General audits or detailed findings about any of the targeted programs. Instead, officials have leaned on broad claims about waste and mismanagement, and even invoked an unrelated $250 million food program fraud case in Minnesota known as Feeding Our Future. That scandal involved pandemic nutrition money, not CDC grants, and legal experts quoted by the Associated Press say using it as justification here looks like guilt by association, not evidence-based oversight.
Given that, how unusual is it that only these 4 states are seeing their CDC infrastructure money pulled while everyone else keeps theirs?
It is very unusual. Cal Matters and the AP both emphasize that the same public health infrastructure grant program keeps operating in the other 46 states and dozens of local health departments. KFF Health News found HIV and health equity projects with nearly identical language to the ones being cut, still fully funded in red states like Texas and Florida. That selective pattern has led legal analysts to argue this looks less like a neutral policy change and more like political punishment of sanctuary jurisdictions.
Which brings us to the lawsuit. When did the states go to court, and what are they asking for?
The Attorneys General of California, Colorado, Illinois, and Minnesota filed a joint lawsuit this Wednesday, February 11th, in federal court in Chicago just 2 days ago. The case is called State of Illinois versus Vought, referring to the Office of Management and Budget Director, and it landed with Judge Manish Shah. According to the AP and Cal Matters, the states want the court to block the administration from pulling the money and to declare the terminations illegal. They argue that the cuts are both arbitrary under administrative law and unconstitutional under Congress's power over federal spending.
Let's break down those legal arguments in plain English. What's the core claim about how the administration is overstepping?
One big piece is the Administrative Procedure Act, which basically says agencies can't make major policy changes on a whim. Legal experts told Bloomberg Law the states are arguing that HHS offered only a vague reference to new priorities and no real explanation for why identical grants in other states are untouched. They point to a 2019 Supreme Court case about the census citizenship question, where the court said agencies cannot hide a political motive behind a flimsy policy rationale. Judge Shah has already signaled in early comments that, given public statements about sanctuary cities and DEI, political animus is at least a plausible explanation here.
And what about the constitutional side? The fight over who controls federal purse strings?
That centers on the spending clause, which gives Congress, not the president, the power to decide how federal money is spent. The states say the administration is effectively rewriting the deal after the fact, trying to impose new conditions like dropping sanctuary policies or DEI language that Congress never approved. They cite Supreme Court cases like South Dakota versus Dole and NFIB versus Sebelius, which say the federal government cannot put a gun to states, heads by threatening huge funding losses unrelated to the program's purpose. According to Just Security's analysis, cutting off core public health infrastructure over immigration disputes is the kind of coercive linkage those cases warn against.
I know there's also something about the executive branch adding new strings to grants, which came up in earlier Trump-era sanctuary fights. How does that play in?
The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers Illinois, has already ruled that the Trump administration could not unilaterally tie local law enforcement grants to immigration cooperation in a case known as City of Chicago versus Barr. Here, the states are saying the same thing is happening with health money. The president is refusing to release funds Congress already appropriated unless these blue states change policies on immigration, DEI, and gender-affirming care. That, they argue, violates both separation of powers and the president's duty to faithfully execute the law. Legal commentators told the AP those precedents give the states a strong foundation.
How quickly did the judge respond once the lawsuit landed?
Very quickly. Yesterday, Thursday, February 12th, just one day after the suit was filed, Judge Shah issued a temporary restraining order. According to the Los Angeles Times and official statements from the state attorneys general, that order lasts 14 days and freezes everything in place. It blocks HHS and CDC from clawing back, freezing, or terminating the $600 million in grants while the court takes a closer look.
What did the judge say about the potential impact if the money were cut right away?
Judge Shah agreed that the states face irreparable harm, meaning damage you really cannot fix later. He cited sworn statements that hundreds of public health workers could lose their jobs almost immediately, and that disease surveillance systems could be dismantled. In his order, he called those networks crucial for tracking outbreaks of things like measles and avian flu, and noted that you cannot just rebuild that expertise overnight if funding suddenly resumes. He also referenced earlier cases, like Cook County versus Wolf, to underscore that undermining local health systems is literally a life and death issue, not just a budget spat.
So as of this morning, Friday, February 13th, what's the status on the ground? Are the checks still going out?
For now, yes. Because of the restraining order, the first wave of cuts that Colorado's Attorney General said could take effect as early as yesterday did not happen. Money is still flowing to state health departments, local agencies, universities, and organizations like Lurie Children's Hospital, the AMA, UC San Francisco, and the Los Angeles LGBT Center. State officials are calling it a crucial, if temporary, reprieve while they get ready for the next court fight.
And that next big moment is a hearing next week, right?
That is right. Judge Shah has scheduled a hearing for next Wednesday, February 18th, where the states will ask for a longer-lasting preliminary injunction. If he grants it, the freeze on these cuts could stay in place for the entire lawsuit, which could stretch for months. The administration is expected to argue that presidents have broad authority to redirect grants that no longer match their policy goals, and that redefining priorities around health equity and gender-related care is a legitimate choice. Legal observers quoted by Bloomberg Law say the judge will likely focus on whether the government can produce concrete, non-political reasons for singling out only these 4 states.
How are leaders in those states responding politically to all this?
The rhetoric has been sharp. California Attorney General Rob Bonta told Cal Matters the cuts are, quote, reckless and illegal, end quote, and warned they would irreparably harm public health. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker called the move a slap in the face to public health professionals and accused the White House of taking a sledgehammer to public health infrastructure. In Congress, California Democrats like Nancy Pelosi and Adam Schiff have framed the move as a transparent attempt to punish blue states, with Schiff writing that the targeting is illegal and must end.
And stepping back, Chloe, why does this particular funding fight matter beyond those 4 states and the immediate court ruling?
It matters because it tests how far any administration can go in weaponizing federal money against political opponents. The Associated Press and the Los Angeles Times both note this fight is part of a broader pattern, where the Trump administration has tried to tie childcare, social service, and even future transportation dollars to states' stances on immigration and DEI, with courts already blocking some of those efforts. If the administration wins here, public health backbone grants like the CDC infrastructure program could become contingent on which party controls state government, rather than on population needs or performance. And as Judge Shah stressed, the stakes are not abstract. They show up in whether Los Angeles or Chicago spots the next measles cluster early, whether rural clinics keep an epidemiologist on staff, and whether LGBTQ seniors or communities of color continue to have tailored health services at all.
A lot riding on those decisions in court next week and beyond. Chloe and Guillen, thanks for laying all of that out for us.
Thank you.
Here are some other headlines. On Capitol Hill, a long-running feud over the Federal Reserve may be nearing a soft landing. Senator Tom Tillis, who had vowed to block every Fed nominee until the Justice Department dropped its criminal probe of Chair Jerome Powell, is signaling support for a compromise. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's off-ramp would move scrutiny of roughly $2.5 billion in renovation cost overruns from prosecutors to the Senate Banking Committee. That could unlock hearings for Kevin Warsh, President Donald Trump's pick to succeed Powell in May of 2026, and set up an interesting clash between Warsh's hawkish resume and his recent push for lower rates and a slimmer Fed balance sheet. In Bangladesh, the ballot box has delivered a political reboot. The Bangladesh Nationalist Party, led by Tariq Rahman, is claiming a landslide in the first election since the July Revolution of 2024 toppled the long-ruling Awami League, which was barred from the race. Early results show the BNP and allies winning about 212 of 300 parliament seats, crushing an 11-party opposition alliance. Voters also passed the July Charter, a constitutional overhaul, adding prime ministerial term limits and judicial reforms meant to keep future strongmen on a shorter leash. Rahman returned in December from 17 years of exile and now takes the reins from an 18-month interim government led by Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus, facing fast pressure to revive the economy, manage ties with India, and decide how hard to pursue former Premier Sheikh Hasina over alleged war crimes. At the United Nations, diplomats are trying to turn artificial intelligence from plot device into policy. The General Assembly has voted by 117-2 to create a 40-member independent international scientific panel on artificial intelligence. Secretary General Antonio Guterres calls it a foundational step to narrow the global knowledge gap. The United States and Paraguay cast the only no votes, branding the plan an overreach and warning against ceding rulemaking to a body they fear could be steered by authoritarian powers. Modeled on the climate-focused IPCC and including Nobel laureate Maria Ressa, the panel is due to deliver its first worldwide risk report by July of 2026. In the tech universe, AI startup Anthropic is rocketing to a new orbit. After a Series G funding round of $30 billion, led by Singapore's wealth fund GIC and investor Coatue, the company now carries a post-money valuation near $380 billion, more than double its level from September of 2025. That makes Anthropic the third most valuable private firm, behind OpenAI and SpaceX. The fresh fuel will power enterprise products and infrastructure, including its Claude Code tool, already at a revenue run rate of about $2.5 billion. As rival OpenAI reportedly readies a $100 billion raise ahead of expected public offerings in the second half of 2026. In the media world, The Washington Post is making headlines by cutting the people who write them. The paper is laying off roughly one-third of its newsroom, more than 300 journalists, dismantling much of its global reporting network. The international desk has been gutted, with bureaus in Cairo, Jerusalem, New Delhi, and Kyiv closed, and coverage from countries such as China, Iran, and Turkey sharply scaled back. Executive editor Matt Murray calls it a strategic reset amid falling search traffic and rising artificial intelligence, saying the paper cannot be everything to everyone. Former editor Marty Barron blasts the move as self-inflicted brand destruction that will leave a vacuum of on-the-ground reporting, and the upheaval has already prompted the resignation of chief executive and publisher Will Lewis. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT 5.1, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.